What happens when you build a race car so devastatingly powerful that the entire sport has to change its rules just to survive? We're not talking about a marginal advantage here. We're not talking about a car that was slightly quicker through the corners or a little more aerodynamically efficient. We're talking about a machine so completely, so utterly, so embarrassingly dominant that it didn't just beat the competition. It made the competition irrelevant. It made racing itself irrelevant. And that is a problem nobody in motorsport history had ever had to deal with before. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the cars that didn't just change racing but broke it entirely. If you're someone who loves the engineering stories behind motorsport's most legendary and controversial machines, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we get into the details, I want you to picture something. You're standing trackside at Road America in the summer of 1972. It's a warm Wisconsin afternoon. The smell of race fuel hangs in the air. You can hear the distant mechanical screaming of the other cars as they navigate the 4-mile circuit, high-pitched, frenetic, the sound you associate with serious motorsport. And then something changes. The ground starts vibrating before you even see it. Then comes the sound. Not the high-pitched scream of a typical race car, but something deeper, angrier. A mechanical howl that makes your chest cavity resonate at a frequency you've never experienced before. The orange and blue Sunoco livery appears as a blur, already doing 180 miles per hour through a section where every other car in the field is struggling to hit 140. The turbos spool up with a banshee wail that cuts through absolutely everything else around you. In the driver's seat, Mark Donohue isn't even pushing hard. He's cruising. And the gap to second place? 45 seconds. And growing. Stunning doesn't even begin to cover it. This is the story of the Porsche 91710, the most dominant race car ever banned from competition. A machine so powerful, so fast, so completely untouchable that it literally broke professional racing from the inside out. Porsche didn't just build a better race car. They built something that transcended the very concept of competition itself. The 91710 won by margins that shouldn't be physically possible, set lap records that stood for decades, and forced the most significant regulatory overhaul in the history of North American motorsport. But here's what most people don't realize. The story of the 91710 isn't really about speed. It's about what happens when human ingenuity operates without boundaries. And the answer, it turns out, is something the sporting world simply cannot accommodate. To understand how Porsche created this monster, we need to travel back to 1969. The Can-Am Challenge Cup was North America's premier racing series. Unlimited. Unrestricted, absolutely brutal in every conceivable way. While Formula One had pages upon pages of technical regulations governing every component on the car, Can-Am had basically two rules. The car needed enclosed wheels and two seats. That's it. No displacement limits, no weight minimums, no restrictions on aerodynamics or exotic materials. It was engineering warfare with a checkered flag, and the engineers who entered it were some of the most brilliant and creative minds the automotive world had ever produced. This freedom attracted the biggest budgets and the most imaginative thinking. McLaren dominated the early years with their big-block Chevrolet-powered M8 series. These weren't just race cars. They were 700-horsepower guided missiles capable of hitting 200 miles per hour on the Mulsanne straight equivalent sections of North American circuit. Bruce McLaren and Denny Hulme won championship after championship. The orange McLarens seemed genuinely unbeatable, and for years, everyone assumed they were. Ferrari tried and failed. Lola tried and failed. Even Jim Hall's innovative chaparrals, with their radical aerodynamics and unconventional engineering philosophies, couldn't consistently challenge McLaren's iron grip on the series. Here's the thing though. Porsche had been watching from Stuttgart. They'd conquered Le Mans with the 917, setting speed records that terrified even the most experienced drivers in the world. Joe Siffert described it as a car that communicated its intentions clearly but punished any mistake without mercy. But Porsche's engineers saw Can-Am's unlimited rules not as a challenge to be managed, but as an invitation to do something completely unprecedented. If McLaren was bringing a knife to a gunfight, Porsche would bring something that made gunfights themselves obsolete. The problem wasn't simply building a fast car. Can-Am cars needed to accelerate explosively out of slow corners, hit astronomical top speeds on long straights, and survive 200-mile races on bumpy North American circuits that would tear a contemporary Formula One car apart within a handful of laps. McLaren's solution was displacement. Massive 8.1-liter naturally aspirated V8 engines that produced their power through sheer cubic inches. Simple, brutally reliable, and devastatingly effective. Porsche took a fundamentally different path, and that path would change motorsport history in ways nobody anticipated. They started with the 917's flat 12 engine, already a masterpiece that had dominated endurance racing at the highest level. But for Can-Am, natural aspiration wasn't going to be enough. The base engine displaced 5.0 liters and produced approximately 600 horsepower. Respectable. Impressive, even. But not enough to challenge McLaren's thundering V8s in a straight fight. Porsche's engineers, led by Hans Mesger and a team of specialists who understood that they were working on something genuinely extraordinary, had a solution that almost everyone else in racing considered unworkable for circuit competition. Turbocharging. Now, you might be thinking, turbocharging wasn't exactly a new concept by 1972. And you'd be right. But here's what most people don't realize. Nobody had successfully turbocharged a race car for sprint circuit racing at this level. Turbos were for aircraft engines and diesel trucks and specific applications where the lag inherent in the technology could be managed or ignored. The consensus in racing engineering was that turbo lag, that infuriating delay between throttle input and power delivery, would make a turbocharged car undrivable on a road course where instant response out of every corner was absolutely essential to competitive lap times. Porsche's engineers didn't care about consensus. They partnered with Eberspacher to develop twin turbochargers specifically engineered for racing applications, and the heart of this beast was designated the Type 917 engine in turbocharged configuration. Starting from the proven 4.5-liter flat 12 architecture, expanded to 5.0 liters for improved torque characteristics, the real transformation happened when those twin turbochargers spooled up. At full boost, 18.8 psi of compressed air being forced into 12 cylinders, the engine produced numbers that looked like transcription errors when engineers first wrote them down. The initial dyno tests showed 850 horsepower at 7,800 revolutions per minute. That was already 150 more than McLaren's best. But Porsche wasn't close to finished. Through aggressive development programs, refined boost mapping, and special qualifying configurations, they eventually extracted numbers approaching 1,100 horsepower. Let that settle for a moment. In 1972, Porsche built a racing car producing over 1,100 horsepower. For context, most modern hypercars with 50 years of additional development, advanced materials science, and sophisticated electronic management systems don't reach those figures. This was half a century ago. The chassis had to be completely reimagined to handle this level of insanity. The original 917 was already a demanding car with 600 horsepower, with nearly double that figure being transmitted through essentially the same basic architecture. Every single component needed to be rethought from first principles. The suspension mounting points were reinforced with additional welding and gusseting. The transaxle was rebuilt with stronger internal gears and dramatically improved cooling capacity. The entire rear subframe was redesigned to cope with torque loads that exceeded anything anyone had previously attempted to engineer around in a road racing context. Look, the aerodynamics told their own remarkable story. Can-Am cars raced on a mixture of road courses and high-speed circuit. The 91710 needed to be stable at 240 miles per hour on fast sections while remaining agile and responsive enough for tight technical corners. Porsche's solution involved what we might today describe as adjustable aerodynamics before the terminology even existed in motorsport vocabulary. The rear wing was manually adjustable, meaning the team could change its angle of attack during pit stops depending on which section of track was coming next. More downforce for twisty, technical passages. Less drag for high-speed runs where straight-line velocity was the priority. This level of strategic thinking was ahead of its time in ways the motorsport world wouldn't fully appreciate until years later. But the genuine breakthrough, the engineering achievement that made everything else possible, was solving the turbo lag problem to a degree that made the car actually raceable. In period turbocharged vehicles, the sequence went something like this. You'd press the throttle. You'd wait some more. And then, suddenly, violently, all the power would arrive at once. Usually at precisely the wrong moment, usually when the car was already pointing somewhere you absolutely didn't want it to go. This wasn't a problem you could manage around with talent and commitment. It was a fundamental characteristic of how the technology worked. Porsche's engineers performed what contemporaries genuinely described as miracles with the Bosch mechanical fuel injection system. They mapped fuel delivery curves to work in harmony with the turbo boost progression rather than fighting against it. They chose smaller twin turbos instead of a single large unit specifically to reduce rotational inertia and therefore lag response. They developed an early form of wastegate calibration that allowed boost to build more progressively rather than arriving in a sudden overwhelming surge. The result wasn't perfect. Donohue himself was clear about that. But it was manageable. And in motorsport, manageable is often enough. Mark Donohue, the driver who would become permanently and deservedly synonymous with the 91710, described the experience with characteristic precision. He wasn't a man who dealt in hyperbole. He was an engineer driver, meticulous, analytical, someone who understood every component of every car he raced in technical detail. And his description of the power delivery evolution was revealing. He said it wasn't like a switch anymore. You could feel the turbos building boost progressively. Sure, there was still lag, maybe half a second, but it was predictable. You learned to anticipate it, to start feeding in throttle before the apex, knowing the power would arrive right when you needed it for corner exit. That description, right there, tells you everything about why this car was so devastatingly effective. The lag hadn't been eliminated. It had been tamed, understood, and incorporated into a driving technique that turned a supposed weakness into a tactical weapon. The first race was Motorsport in June 1972. Nobody knew exactly what to expect. McLaren had won every race so far that season. Denny Hulme was leading the championship with the confidence of a man who expected to win it. The orange cars looked genuinely unbeatable based on everything that had happened up to that point. Then Donohue qualified the 917 for 10 on pole position by 3.9 seconds. Not tenths of a second. Seconds. Nearly 4 full seconds in qualifying for a race where hundredths routinely separate the field. The entire paddock fell silent, trying to process what the timing screens were telling them. The race was, there's no more appropriate word for it, a massacre. Donohue led from the opening lap to the checkered flag, winning by a full lap over the field. The turbo was screaming at full boost down Motorsport's long straight, and he was reaching speeds 30 miles per hour higher than the McLarens. Out of slow corners, the acceleration advantage was so profound that contemporary footage of the race makes it look like the other cars had momentarily hit their brakes whenever the 917/10 appeared in the frame alongside them. Peter Revson, driving the works McLaren M20, said afterward that he'd exit a corner thinking he'd gotten a good run, that he was making progress, and then Donohue would come alongside as if appearing from nowhere. Like Revson had suddenly decelerated dramatically. It was, in Revson's own words, deeply demoralizing in a way that was difficult to articulate to someone who hadn't experienced it. Road America was even worse for the competition. The 4-mile Wisconsin circuit with its long straights and flowing high-speed corners suited the 91710's characteristics so perfectly it might have been purpose-built for the car. Donohue qualified 4.7 seconds faster than second place. In the race itself, he built such a commanding lead so quickly that team owner Roger Penske actually radioed him to slow down. They were embarrassing not just the competition but the series organizers, who were already beginning to have difficult conversations about what this level of dominance meant for Can-Am's future as a viable commercial enterprise. Donohue backed off. Demonstrably, deliberately, visibly backed off. And still won by 45 seconds. This is where it gets really interesting because the technical gap wasn't just about peak power figures, though those were stunning enough. Where McLaren's M20 produced approximately 670 horsepower from its 8.1-liter V8, the 91710 made 850 in race configuration and over 1,000 in qualifying trim. The McLaren weighed 1,650 pounds. The Porsche, despite carrying the additional weight of its complex twin-turbo system, its intercooling hardware, and its reinforced drivetrain components, weighed just 1,660 pounds. The power-to-weight ratio in qualifying configuration was approximately 1.3 pounds per horsepower. To give that number some modern context, a Bugatti Chiron, one of the most extreme production vehicles ever built, has a power-to-weight ratio of approximately 2.4 pounds per horsepower. The 91710 was significantly more powerful relative to its weight than a modern Bugatti. In 1972. But here's the kicker that most people completely miss when they discuss the 91710's dominance. The car wasn't just powerful. It was sophisticated. Intelligently sophisticated in ways that suggested Porsche and the Penske team understood something about racing at a systems level that their competitors simply hadn't grasped yet. The turbo boost pressure was adjustable from the cockpit, meaning Donohue could dial in maximum power for straights, reduce it to conserve fuel during portions of the race where he'd built a sufficient advantage, or back it off to preserve engine life when the gap made full commitment racing unnecessary. The Bosch fuel injection could be trimmed for different atmospheric conditions, different altitudes, different ambient temperatures. The aerodynamic package was adjustable for different circuit characteristics. This wasn't just a powerful car that happened to be fast. It was a complete racing system, and Penske's team operated it with a level of strategic sophistication that was equally ahead of its time. The Watkins Glen race in midsummer revealed another dimension of the 91710's untouchability. Donohue qualified on pole by 2.8 seconds despite deliberately running reduced boost levels to conserve the engine for the race distance. In the race itself, he built a lead so massive, so quickly, that Penske ordered him to pit for a fresh set of tires purely as a theatrical device to make the contest look marginally more competitive for the television audience. Donohue rejoined in third position. He passed both cars ahead within 5 laps and still won by over a minute. The team had essentially inserted a planned interruption into their driver's race, a deliberate delay, and it made no meaningful difference to the outcome whatsoever. The competition was in genuine crisis. McLaren engineers worked around the clock trying to find answers. They rushed development of potential M20 successors, exploring different aerodynamic configurations and attempting to coax additional power from their naturally aspirated V8. But they were fundamentally committed to atmospheric induction, and that commitment put a hard ceiling on what they could achieve. Lola tried boring their existing V8 out to 8.5 liters, chasing cubic inches as a solution to a problem that cubic inches alone couldn't solve. Shadow brought a radical low-drag car that demonstrated genuine straight-line speed but couldn't match the Porsche's capabilities in braking and cornering. Nothing worked. The 917 out of 10 kept winning. usually by embarrassing margins that the series promoters had stopped even trying to explain away to journalists. And then came Mid-Ohio in August. This was supposed to be the track where the turbocharged Porsche would finally show vulnerability. Mid-Ohio is a tight, technical circuit with few long straights and multiple slow corners where raw power matters considerably less than precise handling balance and driver feel. Conventionally thinking through the problem, the McLarens and Lolas should have been genuinely competitive here. The turbo's power advantage would be partially neutralized. The lag characteristic would be more pronounced as a handicap through the slower sections. This was where the opposition finally had a chance. Donohue won by 52 seconds. Here's why. The turbos, rather than being a liability in the slow corners as everyone predicted, were actually enabling unprecedented corner exit speeds in a way nobody had anticipated. The instant the 91710 got its nose pointed even approximately toward the next straight, the boost was building, and by the time the car was fully straightened out, 850 horsepower was available and building toward the next corner, while the opposing cars were still in the process of getting their heavier, slower revving engines up to meaningful speed. The turbo's power characteristic, which everyone assumed would be a weakness on a technical circuit, was actually an advantage in the corner exit phase of every single turn on the lap. The engineers had, perhaps inadvertently, perhaps through profound insight, created a car whose perceived weaknesses were actually strengths in disguise. The moment that truly broke Can-Am's collective spirit was Riverside in October 1972. Porsche brought an evolved version, designated the 91730 in its developmental iteration, featuring improved intercooling and reinforced suspension component. In qualifying, with maximum boost engaged and every system operating at its absolute limit, Donohue obliterated the existing lap record by 5.2 seconds. His pole position time was so far removed from reality that second place was statistically closer to 10th position than to Donohue's benchmark. Journalists covering the event ran out of adjective. The timing screens were checked repeatedly by officials who assumed there had been some kind of equipment malfunction. The race was a demonstration run that happened to have other cars present. By lap 10, Donohue led by 30 seconds. By lap 20, nearly a minute. He was lapping backmarkers before the field had completed a quarter of the race distance. At one point he passed 3 cars simultaneously in a single corner, using the turbo's power to drive around the outside of all 3 on a section of circuit where overtaking was considered essentially impossible. George Falmer, driving a second 91710 entered by the Penske team, finished second, making it a complete Porsche 1-2. The gap to third place exceeded 2 full laps. Can-Am's crisis had graduated from serious to existential. Attendance figures were collapsing because races had become entirely predictable exercises with only one possible outcome. Television ratings followed. Sponsors backing the other teams were having increasingly difficult conversations about return on investment. The fundamental commercial proposition of Can-Am racing, close competition between multiple manufacturers generating genuine uncertainty about race outcomes, had been completely destroyed by a single car from a single manufacturer. Racing series don't survive that. They can't. The uncertainty is the product, and the 917 had eliminated the uncertainty entirely. The 1973 season threatened to be even more extreme. Porsche had developed the 91730, the full production version of the concepts they'd been testing through the previous season. The 5.4-liter engine with full intercooling produced power figures that remain almost incomprehensible even in retrospect. Up to 1,100 horsepower in race configuration. In qualifying trim, with maximum boost and the knowledge that the engine would only need to survive a handful of hot laps rather than a race distance, the output approached 1,500 horsepower. That is not a typographical error. 1,500 horsepower. In 1973. The intercooler, which chilled the compressed intake air before it entered the cylinders, allowed boost pressures that would have destroyed the earlier engine configuration, and the result was a machine that made the already dominant 91710 look conservative. The Sports Car Club of America, which sanctioned Can-Am, faced a choice with no good options. They could allow Porsche to continue, knowing the series would bleed sponsors, audiences, and eventually teams until nothing viable remained. Or they could change the rules in ways specifically designed to neutralize the turbocharged Porsches, which would mean admitting publicly that their supposedly unlimited series had limits after all. They chose the rules. For 1974, Can-Am introduced a minimum fuel consumption figure of 3.0 miles per gallon. They restricted fuel tank capacity, making it mathematically impossible to complete a race distance with a high-boost turbocharged engine consuming fuel at the rate necessary to produce competitive power. Some rounds introduced explicit boost pressure limits, capping turbocharged cars at 12 psi, far below the levels the 91710 and 91730 needed to be genuinely competitive against naturally aspirated opposition. Now, you might be thinking that this kind of targeted regulation is straightforward enough in hindsight. When something breaks the sport, you change the rules. Simple. But here's what most people don't realize about the broader context in which these decisions were made. The oil crisis of 1973 had fundamentally changed the cultural and political environment surrounding motorsport. Suddenly, racing cars that consumed fuel at extraordinary rates seemed not just uncompetitive for other teams but genuinely irresponsible in a public relations sense. Major sponsors began questioning whether association with fuel-hungry racing programs aligned with their corporate communications in an era of petroleum scarcity and dramatically rising energy costs. The combination of targeted technical regulations and external economic pressure created a perfect storm that the 917 program simply couldn't survive. Porsche, reading the landscape with characteristic pragmatism, withdrew from Can-Am after establishing dominance through the 1973 season. The series limped forward with the new regulations in place but never recovered the commercial momentum or the technical excitement that had characterized its peak years. Teams that had invested in Can-Am programs redirected their resources. Manufacturers that had been considering entry reconsidered. The very qualities that had made Can-Am compelling, the unlimited technical freedom, the enormous power outputs, the genuine engineering warfare between manufacturers, had been regulated out of existence by the necessity of containing a single car. The 91710's impact on the broader trajectory of motorsport was seismic and remarkably far-reaching. Here's the thing that most automotive historians don't give sufficient emphasis. The 91710 didn't just win races. It proved, conclusively and irrefutably, that turbocharging was viable for sprint circuit racing at the highest level. That proof had consequences that rippled through motorsport for decades. Within 5 years of the 91710's dominance, turbochargers began appearing in Formula One. The Renault team introduced their turbocharged 1.5-liter engine in 1977, initially unreliable but ultimately transformative. By the mid-1980s, turbocharged Formula One cars were producing power outputs that exceeded even the 91710's extraordinary figures, though with vastly more sophisticated electronic management systems that would have seemed like science fiction to the Penske engineers. The regulatory response to the 91710 created a philosophical template that every major racing series in the world still follows today. When one technological approach becomes sufficiently dominant to undermine competitive balance, rules are modified to restore that balance. Formula One's current hybrid power unit regulations, NASCAR's tapered spacer system, IndyCar's boost limits in oval versus road course configurations, all of these trace their philosophical DNA to Can-Am's desperate and ultimately successful attempt to contain the 91710. The language and the specific mechanisms differ. The underlying logic is identical, but the impact went beyond just racing regulations. The engineering solutions Porsche's team developed to make the 91710 functional and competitive influenced the entire automotive industry's approach to forced induction. The twin-turbo configuration chosen to minimize lag became standard practice in performance applications. The boost mapping strategies developed to achieve progressive, rather than sudden power delivery, informed the development of electronic boost control systems that eventually appeared in production vehicles. The cooling and thermal management solutions required to keep twin turbochargers functioning reliably through a 200-mile race contributed to the knowledge base that made turbocharged engines practical in everyday passenger cars. The telemetry and monitoring systems that Penske and Porsche jointly developed to track engine parameters during races became foundational elements of modern motorsport data acquisition. Watching for boost pressure variations, exhaust gas temperatures, fuel consumption rates in real time, these capabilities seem routine now. In 1972, they were pioneering, driven by the specific demands of managing an engine operating at the very edge of mechanical possibility. Racing series still use monitoring approaches that can be directly traced to the operational requirements of the 91710 program. Mark Donohue's relationship with the car was something beyond the normal driver-machine dynamic. He tested obsessively, logged thousands of development miles, contributed engineering insights that the Porsche team's own specialists incorporated into subsequent development directions. He understood the car at a level of technical intimacy that few drivers of any era have achieved with any machine. His feedback about boost progression, about the lag characteristics at different throttle opening rates, about the chassis behavior under the specific loading conditions created by the turbo's power delivery, directly influenced how Porsche's engineers refined the system through the 1972 season. When Donohue spoke about the experience of driving the 91710 at full chat, at maximum boost with everything working correctly, he described it in terms that suggested the car existed in a performance register that other vehicles of the era simply didn't inhabit. Not faster in the conventional sense of faster, but operating according to different rules, as if physics itself had been renegotiated somewhere in the development process. The car didn't feel like it was going faster than other cars in the series, he said. It felt like other cars were operating under additional constraints that the 91710 had somehow been exempted from. That description, from the most analytically precise driver engineer of his generation, tells you more about what the 91710 actually was than any specification sheet can convey. 6 original 91710 chassis survive in various states of preservation. The most historically significant example, chassis 917/10-002, the car Donohue drove to multiple victories including the decisive Riverside round, sold at auction in 2021 for $5.8 million. Sitting static in a museum environment, it radiates a kind of contained menace that's unusual in historical racing cars. The massive turbo plumbing dominating the rear deck. The impossibly wide rear tires that look like they belong on a different vehicle category entirely. The angular, aggressive bodywork that somehow manages to look fast from every conceivable angle even when it's standing completely still. There's a purposefulness to the design that communicates its intentions without ambiguity. The legacy of the 91710 extends into territory that its creators almost certainly didn't anticipate. Modern racing series have entire regulatory departments whose primary function is what's sometimes called anticipatory governance, identifying technological approaches that could become dominant before they do and building limitations into the rules before any team actually develops them to problematic levels. The FIA's Formula One technical regulations run to hundreds of pages covering details that would have seemed absurdly prescriptive to the engineers who built the 91710. Every one of those pages, every one of those restrictions, represents a lesson learned from a situation where unlimited freedom produced a result that was incompatible with competitive sport. The 2022 Formula One season saw the introduction of cost cap regulations limiting team annual spending. The reasoning behind those regulations, that unlimited financial resources produce unlimited competitive advantages that eventually destroy the sporting proposition, is philosophically identical to the reasoning Can-Am's organizers applied when they introduced fuel consumption limits in 1974. The technology has changed. The budgets are vastly different. The sport and the era are separated by half a century. But the core problem and the core regulatory response are the same. One entity finds an approach that generates such overwhelming advantage that competition becomes meaningless, and the sport responds by constraining the approach. The 9-17-10 established that pattern in its most pure and undeniable form. Roger Penske, who built one of motorsport's most successful organizations across more than 5 decades of competition, keeps a photograph in his office. The 9-17-10 at Road America, half a lap ahead of the entire field, turbos glowing cherry red in the late afternoon light, Donohue barely visible through the wraparound windscreen. Penske has described it as the car that killed Can-Am and simultaneously birthed modern motorsport's regulatory philosophy. That's a more precise and insightful observation than it might initially appear. The 9-17 out of 10 didn't just dominate. It demonstrated a principle. And demonstrating principles, even destructive ones, has consequences that outlast the demonstration by decades. The emotional response to the 9-17-10 among people who witnessed it in period is notably consistent regardless of whether the witness was a fan, a journalist, a competitor, or a series official. Everyone describes the same strange combination of awe and unease. The car was undeniably spectacular. It was visually dramatic, orally overwhelming, and technically impressive in ways that were apparent even to casual observers who couldn't articulate why. But it was also deeply unsettling, because everyone present understood on some level that what they were watching wasn't competition in any meaningful sense. It was demonstration. It was proof. And proof, however impressive, isn't what people come to a race to see. Here's what motorsport had always promised its audience. The outcome is genuinely uncertain. Anyone in the field might win. Skill and strategy and mechanical reliability and fortune would combine in unpredictable ways to determine who crossed the finish line first. That promise, that fundamental uncertainty, is what generates emotional investment in the spectacle. You can't be invested in an outcome you know in advance. The 9-17-10 destroyed the uncertainty so completely that the promise became impossible to make in good faith. Race organizers couldn't tell sponsors, television partners, or ticket-buying fans that the event they were funding or attending had an uncertain outcome. Everyone knew who was going to win before the cars left the grid. This is where it gets really interesting from a broader cultural perspective. The 9-17-10's dominance occurred at a specific moment in North American culture when attitudes toward unlimited corporate and technological power were shifting significantly. The early 1970s saw the emergence of various consumer protection and environmental regulatory frameworks, all premised on the idea that unlimited pursuit of performance or profit in any single dimension created externalities that harmed broader systems. Can-Am's experience with the 9-17-10 was, in microcosm, precisely analogous to these broader cultural debates. Unlimited technical freedom produced results that were impressive but systemically harmful. The response was regulation designed to restore balance. The conversation happening in Can-Am's paddock in 1973 was, structurally, the same conversation happening in legislative chambers and corporate boardrooms across the continent. Now, you might be thinking that this is making too much of a racing car, that there's something overblown about treating a motorsport regulatory dispute as culturally significant. And look, I understand the objection. But here's the thing. The 917 out of 10 story endures not because people are interested in Can-Am regulations from half a century ago, but because it encapsulates a genuinely universal question about the relationship between excellence and competition. What happens when something becomes so good at what it does that the system built around it can no longer function? The answer, in racing as in other competitive domains, is always some version of the same thing. The system changes or the system dies. The 917 out of 10 gives us that answer in pure, crystalline form. Uncomplicated by human factors like political rivalry or personality conflict. Unambiguous in its causation. Porsche built a car that was too good, and the sport changed to survive. Every element of the story leads logically and inevitably to that conclusion. Understanding it tells you something important not just about racing, but about the fundamental tension between optimization and coexistence that runs through competitive systems of all kinds. Donohue himself reflected on the season with an honesty that was characteristic of him. He wasn't someone who embellished or dramatized. When he said that they had built the ultimate race car, that it was too good, that being too good destroyed the thing it was built for, he was making an observation rather than offering a lament. He understood the logic. He'd lived the experience from the closest possible vantage point, and his matter-of-fact acknowledgement that the 91710's excellence had made it incompatible with its intended purpose carries a weight that more emotional assessments couldn't achieve. The car's technical achievements deserve one final moment of explicit recognition before we move toward the larger conclusions this story supports. The 91710's power-to-weight ratio in qualifying configuration wasn't matched by a production car until the McLaren F1 arrived in 1992, 2 decades later. The turbocharging techniques developed for the 91710 program contributed directly to the knowledge base that made modern turbocharged production engines possible, engines that deliver performance with efficiency levels that previous generations would have considered impossible. The data acquisition approaches pioneered by the Penske team became standard practice across all categories of motorsport. The aerodynamic concepts explored on the 917 platform influenced a generation of racing car design. All of that technical legacy, all of those contributions to the broader development of automotive technology and motorsport practice, flowed from a program that lasted barely 2 seasons in competitive form before being regulated out of existence. The 91710 changed everything it touched, including the rules that eventually made it obsolete, and it did so in a period so compressed that contemporary observers barely had time to process what they were witnessing before it was over. The comparison to other dominant periods in motorsport history reveals just how extraordinary the 91710's advantage actually was. Michael Schumacher and Ferrari's dominance in Formula One between 2000 and 2004 was remarkable by any standard, but Ferrari's winning margins were measured in tenths of seconds. They won more often than anyone else, but they didn't win by lapping the field. Red Bull's recent dominance in the hybrid Formula One era is similarly impressive in its statistical consistency, but not in the scale of individual race advantages. Lewis Hamilton's championship years produced brilliant, commanding performances, but never the kind of catastrophic gap that made races meaningless as competitive events. The 917 for 10 winning by 45 seconds while running reduced boost to spare the engine wasn't dominance in the conventional motorsport sense. It was in a different category entirely. It was what happens when a technological step change occurs that's so large it can't be compensated for by driver talent, team strategy, or alternative engineering approaches. Everyone involved on the opposition side was doing their jobs correctly. They were experienced, talented, well-resourced professionals. They simply had no response to what Porsche had created, because there was no response available within the existing technological and regulatory framework. That's the detail that makes the 91710 story unique rather than simply impressive. In most cases of sporting dominance, The losing parties have access in principle to the same approaches as the dominant party and are simply executing them less effectively. In Can-Am in 1972, the opposition had no access to the approach Porsche had taken. You couldn't just bolt twin turbos onto a McLaren M20 and achieve comparable result. The entire car, the entire program, the entire philosophical approach to the problem would have needed to change. And by the time McLaren could have designed, built, and developed a competitive turbocharged response, the series had already been destroyed by what Porsche had already achieved. The most honest assessment of what the 917/10ths represented is perhaps this. It was a perfect solution to the wrong problem. The problem Porsche solved was, how do we build the fastest possible Can-Am car within the unlimited technical regulations? They solved it completely. The wrong part was that solving it completely made Can-Am itself non-functional as a sporting proposition. The solution was incompatible with the context it was built for. Recognizing this doesn't diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes the achievement more interesting, because it raises questions about the nature of success that extend far beyond motorsport. When Donohue strapped himself into the 917-10 for that first Motorsport race in June 1972 and then qualified nearly 4 seconds faster than any other car in the field, he wasn't thinking about whether the sport could survive what he was about to demonstrate. He was thinking about lap times and boost settings and tire temperatures and when to brake for turn 1. That's what racing drivers do. They solve the immediate problem in front of them with everything at their disposal. The larger systemic consequences of solving it too completely weren't his concern, weren't Penske's concern, and certainly weren't Porsche's concern. They were doing exactly what they'd been asked to do, exactly what the unlimited rules of Can-Am were designed to encourage. The tragedy, if that's the right word for it, is that doing it perfectly was doing it too well. The sport's rules invited unlimited excellence. Porsche delivered unlimited excellence. And then the sport changed its rules to prevent anyone from delivering unlimited excellence again. There's a circular logic to that sequence that reveals something fundamental about competitive systems. They depend on limiting the very quality they claim to celebrate. They celebrate excellence up to the point where excellence makes the competition itself impossible, and then they regulate against it. Modern motorsport has internalized this lesson so thoroughly that it operates almost entirely in preventive mode. Series don't wait for someone to build the equivalent of the 917-10 before responding. They design regulations that make the 917-10 impossible in advance. Balance of performance systems, parity-based regulations, cost caps, technical directives, all of these tools are deployed not because anyone has actually done what Porsche did in 1972, but because everyone in motorsport governance knows what happens when someone does. They know because of the 917/10. The car sits in museums now, static and preserved, separated from the circuits it terrorized by half a century of technological and regulatory evolution. But it still communicates something when you stand in front of it. The proportions are wrong in a specific, intentional way. The rear is wider than it seems like it should be. The turbo plumbing is larger and more prominent than aesthetics would suggest. The whole machine has a quality of being slightly too much of everything, too wide, too powerful, too fast, too complete. It was designed without the instinct to hold anything back, without the regulatory framework that tells modern race car engineers to stop before they've used everything they know. That quality, that absence of restraint, is what made the 917 out of 10 historically significant rather than just historically successful. Plenty of cars have won races. Plenty have dominated seasons. Very few have forced fundamental renegotiations of what the sport they competed in was allowed to be. The 917-10 sits in that small, exclusive category. And it sits there not because Porsche was devious or because Penske was opportunistic or because Donohue was exceptionally gifted, though he was, but because everyone involved simply did their jobs as well as they possibly could without any artificial constraints. The result was something the sport couldn't contain. The 917 out of 10 remains the most honest answer motorsport has ever produced to the question of what happens when you genuinely remove all limit. The answer isn't thrilling competition elevated to its highest possible expression. The answer is a machine so superior to everything around it that competition itself ceases to exist. What's left is spectacle without uncertainty, demonstration without drama, speed without sport. Impressive, yes. Unprecedented, absolutely. But ultimately incompatible with the fundamental premise of racing, which is that the outcome should not be known before the cars leave the grid. Porsche built the greatest race car ever made. And in doing so, they built the last truly unlimited race car. Everything that has come after has been designed within constraints that exist, in some part, because of what the 91710 revealed about what unlimited truly means. That's a legacy far larger than any trophy, any lap record, or any championship result. It's a lesson written into the regulatory fabric of every serious racing series on the planet, a lesson that cost Can-Am its existence to teach, but that motorsport has been learning from ever since. What's the most dominant race car you've ever seen? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the machine that literally broke motorsport and remade it in the process, make sure you subscribe to Legacy Motoring for more stories about the cars, the engineers, and the moments that changed everything. Until next time.